Hey guys, today we're going to quit our jobs. But first, how do we quit our jobs? This is a question I actually see asked pretty frequently online. Someone will say, I got a new job offer, I'm really excited about it, but how do I tell my current employer that I'm quitting? Or even, I told my manager that I'm quitting and he asked me to send him a resignation letter. What am I supposed to write in my resignation letter? This is kind of an interesting question to me because there's not really a wrong way to resign. I mean, you're leaving the companies. It's not as if they're going to fire you for resigning improperly. There's really no consequence you can suffer for resigning incorrectly. A resignation letter is mostly a formality. It's essentially just you giving in writing the notice that you're planning to leave the company and specifying when you would like your last day of employment to be. And that essentially is all you need to include in a resignation letter. Your resignation email can be very simple. It literally might just be one sentence that says, let this serve as my formal notice of resignation. My last working day will be some date. It's pretty common to give a 2-week notice period and to specify the date in your email as 2 weeks from the day you're sending the email. So if you send the email on a Friday, your last day of employment would be 2 Fridays from then. There are some important things to consider when you're getting ready to give your notice of resignation to your company. One thing is people often talk about a 2-week notice period, and there's sort of this general assumption of you tell them you're resigning and you'll work this 2-week period where you tie up any loose ends, transition any work, that sort of thing. And usually that does happen, but it's not guaranteed. Some companies have policies in which they don't allow employees to work a 2-week period once they've given their notice of resignation. Essentially, the day you say, I'm resigning, is your last day of employment. One of the reasons a company might not allow employees to work a 2-week notice period is often once you give your notice, you sort of become checked out from a job. You know, you're already thinking about the next thing you're moving on to. There's really no consequences for you not working as hard as you possibly could or really striving to deliver extra value or just generally be a great employee. You know you're moving on. So sometimes they kind of just don't want to let people hang out and not put in a full effort but still get paid their full salary. Additionally, if you're leaving on not very good terms, maybe you've had a tough relationship with your manager or you've had some coworkers you haven't gotten along with very well, the risk of you having a more combative interaction with those folks in the workplace increases once you know you're leaving. Essentially, you have very little fear of repercussions. You know you're going to be starting your new gig in 2 weeks or however much time. And so some companies, just to sort of avoid any possible hiccups or issues or conflicts in the workplace, will say, once you've given your notice of resignation, that's that, and you're done working here effective immediately. Another reason a company might not let you work a notice period is if you're going to a direct competitor. I've seen this in the past at some places I worked, specifically in self-driving. So if you were leaving the company I worked at to go to another self-driving technology company, so essentially a direct competitor working in the exact same space, the company had a sort of default policy of that's your last day. The day you give notice and say, I'm going to go work for a direct competitor, they say, okay, nothing personal, thanks for your work. It doesn't mean you're leaving on bad terms, but you're done effective immediately. That's really just to reduce the risk of any possible exfiltration of data or theft of proprietary technology or IP. I personally think this is sort of a silly policy because obviously if I tell you I'm leaving, I knew before I told you that I was leaving. And so if I was going to try and sneak something out the door, I probably would have just done that before I told you. And there are lots of reasons. There are lots of reasons to not do that. Not the least of which are the legal repercussions you can suffer. The ethical implications of it, and so on and so forth. But at any rate, some companies do have this type of policy saying, if you're going to a direct competitor, when you give your notice, that's that. You're done. Another thing to consider is not only is a 2-week period not guaranteed, it's also not required. I've seen people post interesting things online where they say, I gave my notice at my company and they told me I had to work another 2 months, or I had to work 3 weeks instead of 2 weeks, or I had to do XYZ thing. Except for in maybe some extremely unique circumstances where there's some contractual obligation to deliver something or fulfill something, which would be much more common in the case of a contracted employee as opposed to a W-2 full-time employee. you're under no obligation to work for a company at any time. You could walk in and say, I quit. Here's my computer. I'm done right now. Now, you're definitely burning a bridge by doing that. You're essentially saying, screw you, and I'm not transitioning into my work, and you're on your own. Good luck figuring out the status of things, what's complete, what's not complete, how to get it finished, etc. So this is a pretty aggressive move to make, but it may be warranted in certain cases. If you and an employer have a particularly negative or hostile relationship, I can understand, circumstances in which this might happen. But it's important to know sometimes a manager or a representative of a company will say something to you like, we need you to work 2 months, or we expect you to give us a 4-week notice period. And that's nice that they expect that, but you're, as I said, almost never obligated in any meaningful way to do that. The only thing you really risk is that you may be burning the bridge with that employer. So if they say, we expect you to work for 2 months, and you say, I'm working my 2 weeks and I will do what I can to make sure that the transition is successful, but that will be the end of it, they may essentially say, we consider this to be unacceptable and we would never hire you back because of this behavior. So that just means you won't be able to, in the future, be employed at that company again. In those circumstances, if a company tries to be that pushy about a notice period, that may be not a bad thing anyway. I personally wouldn't want to work at a company that tried to sort of have those strong arm policies and treated its employees that way. There can be some other implications of giving or not giving a 2-week notice period. So, for example, I have heard of companies that won't pay out your PTO if you don't give them sufficient notice. This can vary by state and by the law, employment laws in a particular state. So I can't give any blanket advice here as far as what a company will or won't do if you give them notice or don't give them notice. As I said, in most cases, barring some extreme contractual clause, and that is likely not going to apply to anyone or almost anyone who's a W-2 a standard full-time employee. Barring those cases, you can pretty much quit without any significant repercussions, certainly without any legal repercussions or anything like that. But it's good to know sort of what the specifics are for your area or your state. Another really good resource for this is the employee handbook of the company you work for. Often it will cover some of the basic policies and procedures associated with resignation and notice period, and how the company handles unspent paid time off and things of that nature. So if you're not sure, that's a great first place to look, is any sort of formal employee handbook or similar documentation. You also can often ask your human resources or people operations department for these details. It's important to remember that in some companies, any request to human resources or people operations will be treated as confidential, whereas in other cases, that HR person may reach out to your manager and say, hey, Brad was asking me about our resignation process and whether we would pay out his time off. Do you think he's thinking about quitting? And that will obviously blow your cover if you haven't told your manager yet, or you aren't yet sure what you're doing, or you're still figuring out what your next steps might be. So just something to be mindful of. It's one of those things you sort of have to know your company culture. I think like in larger organizations with more professional HR or people operations teams, they will treat those things more sensitively and more confidentially. Whereas a very small company, say a 20 or 30 person organization where everyone knows everyone, in those cases, it feels more likely to me that word will get out. Managers will talk amongst themselves, or the HR person may tip off your direct manager or your director or someone like that. Hey, I think this person might be getting ready to leave the organization. So just something to be mindful of depending on the sort of culture of the company you work at and the size of the organization. It may or may not be safe to ask your HR team directly for these kinds of details. But again, first place I would check is the employee handbook, because it will often have the details of things like leave policies, resignation, paying out time off, those sorts of things. The last thing I'll say about the sort of generic case of resigning is that you don't have to tell the company anything you don't want to tell them. You don't have to tell them where you're going. You don't have to tell them why you're leaving. You don't have to entertain any discussions with them about why you're unhappy or if you're unhappy or anything like that. Now, they may try to pressure you to do those things, often just by insistently asking the question over and over again. I know I've definitely heard of people who are basically like, my manager is hounding me about where am I going, and I don't want to tell them. And again, you aren't under any obligation to tell them anything you don't want to, but you should probably be prepared for them to ask, and they may ask repeatedly, depending on the culture. And really, I would say it almost depends on the individual. Like, you may have a manager who's particularly insistent about this. At the same time, I think sometimes people feel really uncomfortable with the idea of resigning, and so they make it sort of a combative interaction when it doesn't need to be. I'm not saying you shouldn't tell them anything. I think if you have a relatively good relationship with your manager, with the folks you interact with at your company, including your HR staff, if you interact with them on any regular basis, I don't think there's a good reason to just say, like, I'm going to stonewall you. I'm not going to tell you anything just for the sake of not telling you anything. I'm sure there will be some folks who will disagree with me and say, no, you should just never tell them anything because it only stands to harm you. I kind of view it as basic human decency or courtesy. If I'm leaving on good terms and I've had a good working relationship with someone, especially for a period of time, maybe we've worked together for a couple of years, I'm not going to suddenly act like they're a total stranger and say, I'm not telling you anything. There's no reason you need to know. It's natural and common for people to be interested in, if someone's moving on to a new opportunity, they want to know, oh, what are you going to go do? Is it something you're excited about? That sort of thing. So that's not uncommon. Again, that's sort of a matter of personal discretion and judgment, but I wouldn't say you shouldn't have the mindset of like, no matter what, I shouldn't tell them anything because it's going to be used against me or something. I think in most normal functioning organizations, if you have a good relationship with the folks you work with, there's no reason to be sort of needlessly hostile and clam up about things just because you've decided to leave. So that's the question of, how do I resign? And again, I think that's pretty straightforward, but I actually think a more interesting question is, should I resign? Sometimes people will get a job offer to go to another company and they'll say, this sounds like a great opportunity, and they'll accept it and then immediately go and give their current company notice. When you accept a job offer and don't give your employer a chance to counter it, you're missing out on a big opportunity. So the answer to should I resign depends on a number of factors. If you're unhappy at your current job and you hate your manager and you hate the work you do and you're underpaid and you get a job offer to go do something that seems way more exciting, that pays way more money with a really great team, you should probably just resign. You should probably go tell your manager, found a new job, I'm super excited about it. This is my 2 weeks notice and I'm done after this. But if you love your job and you love your manager and you love your team, but you just don't make quite enough money, and then you get a job offer to go somewhere else that maybe you're not as excited about, and you're not as excited about the team, and the work doesn't seem that interesting, but it pays more money, you probably shouldn't resign. What you should do is go to your manager and say, hey, I have a job offer to go somewhere else that pays more money. What can you do for me to get me to stay? I talked about this a bit in my last video, so I won't rehash all of that. You should check it out. Essentially, it's about how to negotiate a large raise with your current employer. But in the case where there are a lot of things that would potentially get you to stay at your current job, you shouldn't just immediately resign without giving your employer an opportunity to find ways to improve the situation for you. So it's probably helpful to understand what happens on your manager's side of this conversation when you tell them that you're resigning. So if you're a strong performer on my team and you come to me and say, hey, I'm thinking about leaving the company, my job is to understand why you want to leave and then to see if there are things I can do to address those concerns to get you to stay. So for example, if you say, I'm really bored with the work I'm doing, I might have you working on projects that are important and that I really value your efforts on, but I would probably rather put you on different projects than not have you on my team at all. Or if you say, I really like the work I'm doing, I'm happy with the team and everything like that, I'm just not making enough money, I may be inclined to go and try and get you a raise or do something to address the financial side of it to get you to stay. But if you come to me and you say, I accepted a job offer to go somewhere else and this is my 2-week notice, it makes it a lot harder for you and for me to make any adjustments to the situation. It adds a lot of time pressure in a way that isn't necessarily helpful or productive. It also puts you in an awkward position because if you've already accepted a role, now let's say the reason you're leaving is because someone offered you $5,000 more than you're making on my team. That's the only problem is the money. And I go and work on it and I come back and say, hey, I can give you a $7,000 raise. So I'm offering you more than the money that you were going to leave for and everything else you were happy with. Well, that's great. But now you have to go have an awkward conversation with this other company and tell them, you essentially have to renege on the job offer that you accepted. You have to say, actually, I'm not going to come work at your company. I'm going to stay where I'm at instead. And that's like an uncomfortable conversation for you to go and have. I know that, you know that. That's not fun. No one wants to go do that. You kind of feel like a jerk. You made this commitment and this promise essentially that you were going to go join another organization. Now you have to walk that back. And it's just not a fun conversation to have. And you could have avoided having to have that conversation if instead of accepting that offer, you had gone to your manager ahead of time and said, hey, I have this offer that I'm considering versus, hey, I accepted an offer and I'm resigning. I think sometimes people feel pressure when they get a job offer, like I have to accept this and that means I have to resign. But actually, sometimes what you should do is get the details of that offer and go communicate with your current manager and work from there rather than just immediately accepting it. So like I said, sometimes a more interesting question than how do I resign is should I resign? I definitely know people who have gotten what seemed like a really great job offer, accepted it on the spot, gone to their current employer and essentially gave notice. And their employer responded by saying, whoa, wait a minute. We'll basically give you anything you want to stay. More money, better schedule, reduced hours, hire an assistant to take some work off your plate. Essentially, the moon and the stars. Anything that would get you to stay. You're so valuable to our organization. You've been here so long. You understand how all these things work that no one else understands. We couldn't hire someone off the street that has the organizational knowledge that you have. So we are willing to take dramatic steps to get you to stay and to make it worthwhile for you to stay. And then this person has to go and unaccept this job offer and again have this uncomfortable conversation that makes them feel bad on some level, maybe makes them feel like they're betraying the trust or going back on their word that they made to this other organization. And that may not matter to you, but if nothing else, it's an uncomfortable conversation that can be avoided. So the question you probably need to ask yourself before resigning is, why am I resigning? Are there things that could feasibly change about my role, about my compensation, just generally about my working arrangements that would make me want to stay here? Or am I so thoroughly unhappy that I definitely want to leave? There's no circumstances under which I'd want to stay here long term. It's not the right role for me, or the work is boring, or my boss is a jerk, and whatever happens, I just don't want to work for this person anymore. If it's that kind of situation, then yes, resigning probably makes sense. But if it's one or two minor things about your job, it's probably worth having a conversation with your manager or with someone else at your company to see if there are changes that can be made before you just abruptly give your notice and leave the organization. So that would be my recommendation if you're mostly happy at your job and there's just one or two facets that you'd like to see improved, such as opportunities to work on different types of projects or a small adjustment in your compensation or something like that. Hopefully this is helpful and now you feel a little more comfortable with knowing what to expect if you decide to resign, what to put in your resignation email. Again, they're super simple. It's literally just formal notice of resignation and an expected end date. And I would say, again, more importantly and more interestingly, determining when resigning is the right step to take or whether you should consider having more involved conversations with your current manager to see if there are things you can do to improve the aspects of your role that you're unhappy with, whether it's the work, the schedule, the money, etc. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Check out howIgothired.com for more content like this, and I'll see you in the next one.